Thank you so much for being here this morning.
Yeah.
My question is, I'm wondering what the timeline was like during which, China prompted an awakening or an awareness in the leadership of the U.S. Because you described, 9/11 as being a rude awakening that prompted an immediate change in the international security framework.
Okay.
But it seems like China's rise was more of an insidious kind of process, right? And just to give you two pieces of context, I wanted to add that I remember growing up and seeing you on TV, so this is a great privilege. And second of all, over the course of that same time period as I was growing up, people have been, like, from the common, population, people have been saying, oh, you should study Chinese because they're going to be a huge power. They've been saying this for, 20, 25 years. So given that this seemed to be common knowledge, or people had some kind of awareness of it in the common, population, I'm just curious about the disparity between that and how it unfolded with leadership and on the international scale.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think everybody always understood that there was a risk in trying to integrate China prematurely into the international system. But for a long time, the benefits seemed to be outweighing the downside. So I will say that there was the CEO narrative about China, and there was the security narrative. The CEO narrative for a long time was, well, but I can manufacture there. It's cheap labor. There was a time when China was the low-cost labor provider, no longer the case, by the way. I can certainly assemble there. There were great hopes for as China's private sector developed, the Alibabas and the Tencents of the world, that would change the Chinese economic system. They kept promising reforms. I can remember going and talking to Hu Jintao over and over and over about intellectual property protection. And so one of the things that's a little bit difficult to recognize until you've been in those positions is when you've decided on a way forward, you kind of have to put everything into that way forward. So people say, what was plan B? Well, plan B was to make plan A work, right? And so you keep on that course. And so for a long time, it looked like the benefits were okay. The Chinese were actually very helpful on North Korea. They actually chaired the six-party talks. Now, the North Koreans ignored them a lot. That was a surprise to me, but they really did. But it wasn't as if things were going so badly that you would have the kind of abrupt recognition that you had after 9/11. But then I think what really brought it to a head was Xi Jinping comes to power, and he, instead of continuing to kind of build that, he decides to act on it. And now the security people who'd been warning for a long time about what was going on in the South China Sea, about what was going on in and around Southeast Asia, when I was secretary, the Chinese had an anti-satellite test in 2007 that just shocked everybody as to its capability. And so now all of a sudden, when the Chinese start reversing some of the economic gains, the security narrative and the CEO narrative start to come together. And now you, with Xi Jinping, who's much more frontal about it, you begin to recognize. And I think that's really when it started, maybe 7, 8 years ago, the recognition that maybe this integrationist narrative had failed. Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Emma. I worked in the EEOB and the West Wing, so I look forward to going back one day.
Fantastic.
And I enjoyed you even talking this morning about decision making. And I was curious what more you had to say about making these sensitive decisions about, developing problems by withholding sensitive information, but also working across groups of experts and other principles to gain insight and make wise decisions. But also, you talked in your book about not raising alarms before it was time. So I was wondering if you could speak to that policy.
Yes, and I'm going to give you a specific example. I've been reading a lot in the release of these Afghan papers. Well, they didn't tell the American people that they were concerned about the Afghan army. Yeah, you're going to go out and say, they're a mess, that Afghan army. And I'm going to hold a press conference and say, they have no hope. Well, what does that do for the morale of the Afghan army? What does that do for the morale of the Afghan government? What does that do for the Taliban, who says, even the Americans think they aren't very good? So you are right that not all sensitive information gets communicated, and sometimes it gets leaked. But there are things that you don't communicate, either because you're trying to work them out and it would make it more complicated to try to work them out, or because it would be strategically, it would make you strategically more vulnerable to release certain kinds of information. So, and then sometimes you have to worry about whether you can actually deal with the outcome if everybody knows. So I'll give you one very good example of that. How many of you know that there was a smallpox scare in the United States in the winter? You read my book. In the winter of in the winter of 2002. How many of you knew that there was a scare for a radiological attack on Washington, D.C. in October of 2001? Now, the president called his advisors together on the smallpox threat, and he said, we hadn't vaccinated for smallpox since the 50s because it had been eradicated. And he asked whether we should try to vaccinate the country. And the head of the CDC said, well, Mr. President, 5% of the population would have an adverse impact. And he said, what is an adverse impact? They would die. Right? So now he has to decide, do I try to vaccinate the whole country and possibly lose 5% of the population? Do I tell people that do I act even though we don't know if the threat is real? The decision that he made was to vaccinate first responders, to vaccinate the armed forces, and there were some of us who were on the list who had to be vaccinated. On the radiological attack, he faced an even more interesting question of what to tell people. I had come out of a national security principals meeting to go down and report that we were going to move. We had only 3 radiological units, 2 on the West Coast, 1 on the East Coast. We were going to move them all to the East Coast. And he said, and he was in the Oval Office and he was looking down. He looked quite troubled. And I said, Mr. President, what's wrong? And he said, I told my friends from college to come spend the weekend with me. I just thought it would be nice to get a little bit of release. This is October 30, 31. And I had actually told a friend of mine to come that weekend. He said, should I tell them not to come? I said, of course you have to tell them not to come. He said, but if I tell them not to come, don't I have to tell the American people about the threat? I said, Mr. President, if you say that, are you telling people to evacuate the Capitol? Are we even remotely ready for the evacuation of the Capitol? And so you're always weighing how much information, if you have no answer for what to do in that case, then you try to write it out. You try to protect as best as possible. But you set off events that you cannot control if you simply put the information out there. You might remember that we had this not terribly successful system. You may be all too young to do it, but Homeland Security created these color codes. The terrorist threat today is yellow, it's orange, it's green, it was never green, it's red. And they would just kind of move it. And I would say, what precisely caused it to move today? And nobody could kind of figure it out. So information and how you use it and with whom you communicate, what allies do you tell? Obviously, if it involves them, then you tell them. But do you tell everybody around them? These are hard questions in decision making. Yes. Right here. I'm going to go over there in a minute. Right. Yeah.
Did you call on me?
Yes,
okay.
I did.
Thank you for your time, Dr. Rice, and I'm a great admirer of you and your work. But my question pertains more to your perspective as former provost of Stanford and now director of the Hoover Institute. 2 days ago, H.R. McMaster described a very problematic spirit of self-loathing that's consuming academia and the mainstream political left. And he said, if this persists, we may not be able to maintain our leadership on the global stage. Do you agree with that? And if so, what can be done to turn the ship around?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. The United States, in order to lead, you have to be confident. Now, confidence doesn't mean hubris. We fully know the history of the United States. My parents and I couldn't go to a movie theater or a restaurant in my hometown of Birmingham, Alabama because of Jim Crow. So I would see the United States of America through rose-colored glasses. And I used to go to other places, and I would say, but I will defend to you that when it comes to dealing with difference, the United States is better than any place in the world. Any of you want to stand up and say that both your National Security Advisor and your Secretary of State are black? Any of you want to say that? And so you can, if you are in those positions, you can acknowledge the troubled history of the United States. You can acknowledge how long it has taken us for democracy, which is one reason we shouldn't be so impatient with others who are trying to build democracy. But if it becomes, and if you teach our kids that they ought to hate the United States for its problems, rather than love the fact that we keep trying to make it better, you are undermining our confidence, undermining our will, and I can guarantee you, you will undermine our ability to act, and that will make it a more dangerous world. And so what can be done about it? People have to start to fight back. You have to have courses that are taught by people who will give a balanced view. I'm not asking for a whitewashed view. I'm asking for a balanced view. Fortunately, here at Stanford next year, there's actually going to be in the core, we now are reestablishing core, a course on citizenship. And there's a chance that a couple of Hoover people might teach in it. I think that's a good step forward. In K-12 education, why would we teach 8-year-olds that they are inherently racist because they're white? Why would we do that? They generally don't even yet see skin color. Or they might say, why are you brown? But it doesn't mean anything. And so this has got to be backed off, and it has to be backed off in a major way. I will say this, when the Chinese foreign minister lectured the Secretary of State in Alaska about human rights, I asked myself, what would I have done in those circumstances? And I think I might have turned to him and said, you know, when your vice president, if you can find one, has to certify before your legislature, which, by the way, has no power, that he has lost power and is about to transfer power to someone else. When you can do that, you can lecture me. But when Xi Jinping has no peer, don't lecture me about human rights and democracy. And oh, by the way, this meeting is over. And thank you very much for coming to Alaska. Because that moment, again, was a blow at American pride and at American credibility. Let's see, over here, yes.
Secretary Rice, it's an honor. I had a question on your comments about Russia. You said that they are a declining power, and I was wondering if there's any possibility in which that could be a premature characterization of them, given that the current version of Russia, the Russian Federation, has only been around for about 28 years. And as you know way better than I do, the 90s was the Wild West as far as like economic in Russia. So given that pretty much when Putin has been in power for 20 years and Medvedev, of course, is it fair to say they're a declining power given their relative like newness and as far as like possibility that they could evolve further from this petro state?
Yeah, it's a good question. So let's think about it this way. What are the assets of global power, of a global power? Okay, military power is one asset. The Russians certainly passed the test there. They are capable of worldwide operations. They have rebuilt a lot of their capability for worldwide operations. There was a time right after the collapse of the Soviet Union when they basically couldn't leave their bases. But they've rebuilt that power. So militarily, they check the box. They have political authority through the UN Security Council because they are one of the 5 members of the UN Security Council with a veto. And so they can affect policy in that way. But if indeed economic power and technological power are the coin of the realm of the future, there they are sorely lacking. Not only is it still a kind of 19th century extractive industries economy that's very dependent on the price of oil, which, by the way, if we would allow the United States to continue to be an oil giant, we wouldn't see Russia in such a great position to use its oil diplomacy, but its resources are not generally now thought of the way. And technologically, because it is a state-owned kind of cartel that runs the economy, the kind of innovation and creativity that you see on the technological side in India, in China, in the United States isn't happening in Russia. If anything, those people are trying to come here or to Tel Aviv and do that. And so the reason I say that it's a declining power, and maybe you're right, maybe it's a decline to power, is that it doesn't have the assets of global power that we would associate with a great power. It actually never did have economic assets, but it had built its own little ecosystem with Comecon and all the East Europeans having to feed into their system. They've also lost, remember, enormous amounts of their territory with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because of course the Soviet Union was basically the footprint of the Russian Empire in the late 19th century, and it is now basically the footprint of Russia at the time of Peter the Great. So that's why I say it's a declining power. Yeah. Yes.
Dr. Rice, thank you for being with us today and for speaking to us. I'm Max, and I'm at the Belfer Center. My question goes more on the Russia question. I'd be interested, given your impressive career both in government but both as a scholar, on Russia. Where would you land on this administration's choice on Nord Stream 2? Yeah. If you have any views on that.
Yeah. I would not have done it. Their view is, Nord Stream 2 was going to happen, and it was just an irritant with the Germans, so we just remove it. But there are some things that are worth continuing to challenge, and I don't really get it with the Germans. Let's shut down nuclear power. France gets 80% of its generating power from nuclear. Let's shut down nuclear power and be more dependent on Russian natural gas. That's really not very wise, and I think we didn't have to participate in it. My concern is that it's a part of a larger energy policy that, again, shifts the cards in the energy side to the Russians, the Iranians, and others of that ilk. Because when the United States was prepared to have the North American energy platform, one of the great gifts in human history, to be able to build from Canada down through Mexico, the Mexicans having changed their constitution to allow foreign investment in oil and gas, when we were discovering shale everywhere and becoming a net exporter, not to mention energy independent, then the whole diplomacy of oil and gas changes. I was Secretary of State when oil went to $147 a barrel. Nothing warps international diplomacy like oil at $147 a barrel. It empowered Hugo Chavez to go and buy elections all over Latin America. It empowered the Iranians to resist sanctions on their nuclear program. It empowered the Russians to play games with the Ukrainians and the Hungarians and others. And so I think Nord Stream 2 is a bad decision, but I'm more concerned about the fact that it's a part of a bad energy policy. Because look, all of us recognize that climate change is real. It has human causes. All of that is true. All of us want to transition to cleaner fuels, which is one reason that nuclear and natural gas make sense. But who are we kidding? We're going to be dependent on hydrocarbons for a long time to come. We still haven't figured a way, for instance, to fly an airplane with electricity. And so if we're going to be dependent on oil and gas for a long time, I would rather that come from the North American platform than from Russia. Let's see, right here on the end.
You mentioned a credibility issue, especially with the United States kind of trying to preserve this international order, especially as we're seeing now with Afghanistan and before with the Iraq War and our human rights violations. In what ways do our strategies kind of need to change in order to prevent that kind of thing from happening again?
Yeah, well, I'm not quite sure what you may mean by human rights violations. Let's talk about the wars. And I don't think that you will find a military that is more attentive to issues of civilian casualties than the American military. The sad truth is, though, that civilian casualties happen when you are in war zones. One of the questions I'm often asked is, well, what if something were against your values? Then you don't do it. But the truth of the matter is you're usually dealing with competing values. So if you ask about, for instance, drones, which I have grave concerns about, but if the value is, do I kill that nest of terrorists in the Pakistani mountains, knowing that some innocent civilians are going to die, or do I let the nest of terrorists kill innocent civilians in larger numbers? That's a challenge of values. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I'm not quite getting what you mean.
Sorry, I think, civilian casualties are obviously a hard issue to kind of get around, exactly to your point. I think I'm more so talking about like issues of like Abu Ghraib and kind of like what the U.S. media published about our efforts.
Yeah.
Just in the sense that, you know, if we are trying to preserve this international order and yet we have these kinds of like very, very alarming issues that we know about and others that we don't know about.
Got it. Abu Ghraib was a stain on America. Full stop. You may not know, Secretary Rumsfeld actually offered to resign as a result of Abu Ghraib, and the president said no. The fact is you can't account for all bad behavior as hard as you might try. And the people who did Abu Ghraib were punished for it. And I think one answer to how do you establish that credibility in the light of things like Abu Ghraib is you make clear that that is not acceptable. And by the way, it wasn't acceptable to the American military, it wasn't acceptable to the foot soldier, it wasn't acceptable to anybody. And so you punish it under those circumstances. When it comes to Guantanamo, on the other hand, what were you going to do with them? You had the world's most dangerous terrorist. And I can tell you that all of those Congress people who were talking about let's close Guantanamo, when you said, okay, let's transfer Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to your to a prison near you, oh no, not in my neighborhood. And so in war, unfortunately, sometimes, and by the way, Guantanamo was not, we did a really nice job with Guantanamo. You know, we were attentive to people's religious circumstances. A few people even took the opportunity to learn English. I'm not saying it was a great thing to be in Guantanamo, but I was told that it was better than some prisons in my home state. So in war, you do the very best that you can. If somebody is out of line, you punish it. And you own it when something like Abu Ghraib happens. And that, I think, helps people to understand that the United States of America doesn't simply try to whitewash things of that kind. And oh, by the way, the reason that we closed black sites, and I was a huge advocate of closing black sites, was because I told the president, we don't disappear people. I don't care what horrors they've done, we don't disappear people. And that's why we brought them back to Guantanamo. So you do the best under really hard circumstances. Let's see, I'm going to take a few more here. Yeah, right here. Yes. Can't see your name tag from here, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, my name is Mark. I'm from Copenhagen, Denmark. So thank you for defending us over many years.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask on Europe, on spending, which has not been talked about, but
Yes.
But the irony with the U.S.-Europe relationship is that when we're certain of a U.S. president, then we don't pay so much and there is stability in world order. And when we are uncertain of a U.S. president, then we spend more. In Denmark, Trump was there, we're like, oh, we're maybe not so certain.
Yeah.
He wants to buy us. He's probably not going to.
Yeah.
We were not so sure about the defense.
Yeah.
Or buy Greenland, sorry. So yeah, how do you keep stable alliances while you at the same time make Europe play its part in balancing both Russia and China?
That's such a good question, Mark, because, you know, every American Secretary of State, every American Secretary of Defense, every American president, please pay your 2%, please pay your 2%. And then President Trump says, pay your 2% or I won't defend you. I thought, okay, well, that's not a line I ever thought of using, all right? And so, yes, it is ironic that that's what it took to get the 2% contributions paid. Now I think we have to just keep pressing on that. To a certain extent, I was reading that the Europeans were also again having this discussion. If they can't count on the United States, might they have to defend themselves? I don't actually think this is a good answer. I remember when there was talk of a French-German alliance to protect against, and I thought, no, with all due respect to the French and the Germans, that's not going to frighten Vladimir Putin. So you probably want to keep the United States in there. It's a constant struggle, Mark, but you just have to keep working at it. You have to keep working at the fact that these are our allies. We've done so much together. I will say that even without the 2%, the response of the NATO allies in Afghanistan was really pretty remarkable. Many of the Afghan allies carried out provincial reconstruction teams, paid for it themselves. One of the things that we apparently did wrong a couple of days ago is we didn't tell people exactly when we were leaving, which isn't, yeah, you should have been upset. But I do think that we've gotten a lot done together, and yes, we need the 2%, but we also need a kind of restructuring or rethinking about what it is we need to achieve together. So, for instance, there's a lot of yelling at each other about issues of privacy in cyberspace, and the U.S. companies and so forth. But whatever our differences about privacy, they pale in comparison to the way the Chinese think about privacy, which I don't think they even have a word. So I would say let's try to concentrate on the things we can do together. I think I've got time for one more question. I'm going to take somebody all the way in the back.
Thank you so much for your time this morning. You've mentioned our global hotspots, and I'm just curious, what are certain variables or things that we should keep an eye out in terms of other potential countries that aren't yet global hotspots? Is it the first mover? Wait until there's another 9/11 attack? Like what identifies a rising global hotspot? And you also mentioned that in terms of credibility, our military size and attack isn't really that much of a big issue, because that's one thing that we're kind of feared as. But just briefly looking at the military numbers, they're kind of on the decline. Mm-hmm. One thing that I read recently was that the military is having a hard time recruiting because of the obesity rate, and they're also having a hard time keeping top talent. Do you believe that in the future our military size might be something that we need to pay more attention to? I'd love to hear your takes on that.
Sure. Let me take the hotspots issue first. I think we kind of know where they are. It's just that they recede for a while sometimes. The North Koreans go quiet for a while, and then all of a sudden they explode something. Or the Iranians pull in their horns for a little while, but then all of a sudden they do something. I think you have to assume that even if we know what the hotspots are, the way that you deal with them is that you try to deter those eruptions of them. So I didn't talk about North Korea, but North Korea is kind of a very good example of this. The North Korean nuclear program is progressing, but you can't actually progress a nuclear program very far without testing, because a nuclear device, you don't succeed a little bit and then a little bit more and a little bit more. You succeed or fail, succeed or fail, succeed or fail, and one day you succeed, right? And that's when you know that they had that capability. If you could keep them from testing, that's one way from keeping what we know as a hotspot from erupting into something problematic. Iran, if you can keep the intelligence capabilities and the counterterrorism capabilities, and keep reminding the Iranians that if those militias get too far out of control, we will hold Tehran responsible, maybe you can damp down that hotspot. So the way that you deal with what I think we know are known hotspots. Now I'll tell you one that I'm really quite concerned about. Venezuela is really collapsing or has collapsed. And the border with Colombia and the other Andean states is very dangerous these days. And so that's something that I think we haven't paid enough attention to in recent years. And it's, again, a way to deal with the hotspot. When it comes to military capability, yes, I recognize that we're having some difficulties recruiting. In part, when the job market is really good, we always have a little trouble recruiting. We also have trouble recruiting foreign service officers at that point in time. But I think that if we continue to look at compensation issues, for instance, one of the big issues a few years ago was housing for the military. It had really deteriorated. We looked at some of it on some of the bases when I was with President Bush, and it was just awful. You wouldn't ask anybody to live in that. So you need to keep trying to make the packages of compensation and the like attractive to people. The skills that are needed in the military are also shifting. And so we had recently here the commander of Space Command, and they need to recruit people who have STEM qualifications. That's a hard recruiting task against the Silicon Valley and all of the stock options that you can be provided. And so we also are going to have to look at skills development and who we're getting. I do think that it goes back to the question that you asked about the loathing. Look, I obviously don't like white supremacists any more than anybody. That ought to be obvious. But I'm a little worried about a narrative about our military that it's somehow a hotbed of white supremacy. Look, 19-year-olds will look at stuff that they shouldn't. Trolling the websites or the social media of 19-year-olds and then drumming them out of the armed forces because they looked at something that they shouldn't. I'm all for trying to make sure that we don't have an extremist problem within our own military. But you can really overdo it. And you can really also send messages that make your recruiting even harder. And so I think the way that we talk about this is also a real element. And the final thing I'll say about the military is the Pentagon's not the greatest at figuring out how to structure our forces for the threats of today. We have a lot of legacy systems that keep getting built, even though they don't seem to make much sense in the constant environment. The Chinese are not probably going to fight us one for one. They're going to go asymmetric, and we need to figure out how to deal with that. And Congress is a big part of that problem. I remember coming in the Bush administration, and there was only one system that we said we wanted to kill. And it's still there because it had too many congressional supporters to get rid of it. So our planning system is not the best for using what we have well. Thanks very much. It was great being with you. Hope you enjoy the rest of the time.